Hi guys. Last week we covered joinery and we learned how to recreate some of that missing reference face for bent lamination. Now I want to start getting into some more advanced and more interesting techniques, and one of those is going to be coopering. So you may have heard a coopered wine barrel. That's probably the most common application of coopering. You'll also see coopering in boat building and cases where people do not want to make a bent lamination and they want to make a curved surface. They will cooper solid pieces of wood, meaning they'll cut angles on one side or both sides of a piece of wood and glue it together to form facets of a curve. And then you can actually make a dedicated curved hand plane for either side of that coopered surface and hand plane that side to like a perfect round, which is really interesting. And then even more exciting is that you can cooper bent surfaces, including bent lamination. So this is a sample coopered piece, and you can see it's only been coopered on a single side. So that gives it a pretty distinct aesthetic look because it sort of looks like the pieces are feeding into each other. It gives it a bit of a sense of directionality. And then this is another coopered piece, and this has been coopered on both sides. So you can see these pieces are symmetrical instead of being cut on only a single side. And you can start to create from a pretty simple two-dimensional curve, you can start to create some really interesting three-dimensional structures. So you can see this at one point was just a very like exaggerated U-bend. And then by cutting that cooper in it, I'm starting to create almost like a seashell structure to it. And I'm starting to create a very like distinct positive and negative space. If I continued to cooper these pieces so that it closed the form entirely, I'd have this interior column on the inside of my form, which could be really interesting. And then this piece, basically everywhere where you're not cutting an angle. So you can see I ran this piece on this MDF form over the table saw, and you can cooper on both the table saw or the bandsaw. Typically, if I have a very tall cooper, I'll go to the bandsaw and I'll clean it up with a hand plane. If I have a short cooper, I'll just do it on the table saw because it tends to be a bit cleaner. But this piece I just coopered on a single side on the table saw. I think I actually just reused the mold that I originally bent these pieces on. Another thing you can do is that if you've made your master template removable, you can just pop off your master template and start making copies of it to make a cuttable jig on the table saw or bandsaw. But you can see this piece everywhere where it hasn't been coopered. So from basically the center, the apex of this curve, it becomes negative space. So if I had coopered along the entire edge of the curve, this would be a closed form and it would look closer to a vase. But because I didn't cooper along the entire edge, it becomes an open form and gives more the appearance of like a rib cage. Same with this piece. If I had wanted it to be a solid, more monolithic form, I would have coopered all the way up to this edge, meaning I would have had to bend much wider laminates to get away with that. But for sure, like if you guys have your leftover 1-part or 2-part molds and your bends, I would suggest you have some fun and see what sort of weird shapes you can make just by introducing an angle to a bent lamination. These are the standard thickness veneer pieces that you saw me bending earlier this semester on that vacuum form that really fought me on every single step. So I have 6 pieces. I tried to treat the pieces consistently so that they would have consistent spring back. They're all slightly different. And then using that piece that I cut the square edge on the bandsaw, I then trace that onto a piece of MDF to create a silhouette that would support this curve while I'm coopering it. And that would incorporate the spring back that was already there. So I'm not fighting to get this piece onto my mold. Instead, I'm creating a sacrificial jig that I'll be cutting into with the spring back already reflected in the curve. So I've started making that jig now. So I have that original piece of MDF that I shaped to match the profile of this vase curve. And then I traced that original curve onto a bunch of pieces of MDF, rough cut them on the bandsaw. And then because I don't want to risk cutting through any metal or hardware on the table saw since I have a saw stop, I've just been gluing these pieces together. So I positioned these two extra big pieces on either side of my original template, my master curve, and just glued them up in my bench vise. And now I've set up my router table with a flush trim bit to ride along the master template and cut my other two pieces flush. And then once I've cut this piece flush, I can flip it over and cut the top piece flush. Then I'll go back and glue on my two extra big pieces again and do the same thing. Okay, so I flush trimmed these inner 3 layers to the master template. Now I've glued on 2 more extra large bandsawed layers that I'm going to flush trim again. I just wanted to mention that I did end up using a top bearing flush trim bit. The bottom bearing just had like a temporary brain fart and forgot that this setup would only work with a top bearing. So now I should be able to flush trim this on again, and then I'll probably glue on another 2 layers just to make my jig extra wide so I'm not doing a balancing act on the table saw when I cooper.